This is Chapter 3. At this level, authority is no longer about sounding confident, it's about being trustworthy when the answer isn't ready yet. Most breakdowns in diagnostics don't start in the bay. They start at the counter in the first 30 seconds of conversation when pressure is high and someone asks the most dangerous question in the shop, "So what's wrong with it?" For many advisors, that question feels like a test. A moment where silence feels like weakness and certainty feels like control. So they reach for an answer, not because it's proven, but because it lowers the tension in the moment. That move feels helpful. It's also where chaos begins. At Tier 3, the fastest way to lose authority is not to admit uncertainty. It's to pretend it doesn't exist. False certainty creates expectations that reality cannot support. When the story changes later, as it often does in complex diagnostics, the customer doesn't hear clarification. They hear contradiction, and once that happens, trust collapses quickly. This chapter exists because multi-system diagnostics are where shops quietly bleed time, credibility, and morale. One guest sentence can bend an entire day around a job that was never led correctly. Bays stall. Texts get interrupted. Customers feel misled. Advisors end up defending words they should never have said. Tier 3 leadership understands something critical. Uncertainty does not need to be hidden to preserve authority. It needs to be structured. When you can stay calm without an answer, when you can define boundaries instead of making promises, when you can lead process instead of prognosis, complexity stops spreading chaos through the shop. This chapter is about that shift. Not fixing cars faster, not sounding smarter, but learning how to lead when the truth is still unfolding, without losing control, consent, or trust. That is the standard we're setting in Chapter 3. False certainty breaks trust faster than uncertainty ever will. At Tier 3, certainty is no longer a performance tool. It's a liability when it isn't earned. Most advisors are trained, intentionally or not, to believe that confidence equals authority. When a customer asks what's wrong, silence feels dangerous. Hesitation feels like weakness. And uncertainty feels like incompetence. So advisors fill the gap with something that sounds helpful: a likely cause, a common failure, a familiar pattern. It's probably the starter. These usually have a bad censor. I've seen this a lot. Those phrases lower tension in the moment. They also plant a landmine. Because diagnostics, by definition, are investigative. And investigation means the story is allowed to change as evidence emerges. The moment you present a guess as an answer, you've locked yourself into a narrative reality may not support. When that happens, the customer doesn't hear "we learn more." They hear "you were wrong." Or worse, "you weren't honest." False certainty doesn't just risk one conversation. It destabilizes the entire job. The technician now has a shadow promise hanging over their work. Every test that points in a different direction feels like friction instead of progress. The advisor feels pressure to justify earlier words instead of leading the process. Time gets wasted managing expectations that never should have existed. Uncertainty, handled correctly, does the opposite. When you name uncertainty early, clearly, calmly, and without apology, you reset expectations to match reality. You remove the emotional trap. You stop selling outcomes and start selling process. And process is something you can control. At Tier 3, authority comes from boundaries, not bravado. Boundaries tell the customer, "Here is what we know. Here is what we don't know yet. Here is how we will find out. Here is how much time we will spend before we stop and talk again." Those boundaries replace fear with orientation. Customers don't need you to know everything immediately. They need to know that nothing will happen without their understanding and consent. False certainty collapses later and costs more. Honest uncertainty, structured properly, builds trust before the answer even exists. That is why this chapter is anchored here, not on fixing the car, but on protecting truth while it's still forming. So here's the question that exposes whether you're leading diagnostics or letting discomfort run the conversation. Are you selling answers or are you pretending to have them? That question matters because pretending feels efficient in the moment. It smooths the conversation. It quiets the room. It gives the illusion of control. But it also creates an invisible contract you didn't intend to sign. When you imply certainty without proof, the customer builds expectations immediately. They tell themselves a story. Okay, that's what it is. That's what I'm paying for. That's what should fix it. Every step after that is judged against the sentence you spoke under pressure. If the technician later finds something different, the customer doesn't see investigation. They see contradiction. If more time is needed, they don't see diligence. They see backtracking, and if the repair changes, they don't see honesty. They see bait and switch, even when none existed. That's how good shops lose credibility without ever lying. The most common trigger for this mistake is pressure. A full lot. A waiting customer. A tech needing uninterrupted time. A phone call demanding an answer right now. Under that pressure, advisors confuse speed with leadership and certainty with control. But leadership in diagnostics looks different. Leadership says, I don't know yet, and I'm not guessing. Leadership says, we're buying answers, not parts. Leadership says, here's the process, the boundary, and the next checkpoint. When you do that, the customer stays oriented. They understand what they're paying for. They know when they'll hear back. And they don't feel trapped inside an open-ended mystery. So ask yourself honestly, when uncertainty shows up, do you reach for a guess to calm the moment, or do you build structure to carry it? Because in diagnostics, trust isn't lost when the answer takes time. It's lost when you sound certain before you've earned it. Hold that distinction. The next part of this chapter shows you exactly how to turn uncertainty into command without losing authority, technician time, or customer consent. At Tier 3, diagnostics stop being a technical event and start being a leadership test. The problem is not that vehicles are complex. The problem is that complexity exposes weak decision leadership faster than anything else in the shop. Multi-system diagnostics force you to lead without certainty, and that makes many advisors uncomfortable. Not because they don't care, but because they were trained to believe authority comes from having answers, not from guiding the process that finds them. This is where most shops quietly lose control. When an advisor guesses, they are trying to end discomfort, not serve the customer. The guess feels efficient. It calms the moment. It keeps the bay moving for a few minutes. But it also creates a fragile promise that the technician never agreed to and the evidence may never support. Tier 3 discipline replaces guessing with process ownership. The first skill is separating known from unknown in real time. This sounds simple? It isn't. Under pressure, advisors blend facts, patterns, and assumptions into one narrative because it sounds smoother. That blending is what creates the "you told me" trap later. Clear language prevents that trap before it exists. You state what is verified. You state what is suspected. You state what has not yet been tested. Nothing else belongs in the conversation. The second skill is selling diagnostic time as a professional service, not as a prelude to a repair. Diagnostic labor is not a penalty. It is skilled work designed to prevent unnecessary parts replacement and repeat visits. Customers resist diagnostics when it's presented as vague or open-ended. They accept it when it is bounded. Boundaries are everything. You define the time bracket. You define the goal of that time. You define the checkpoint where the vehicle stops and consent is renewed. Boundaries tell the customer this will not turn into an endless meter running without their permission. The third skill is protecting technician focus. Diagnostics fail when advisors interrupt the bay repeatedly to satisfy anxiety instead of honoring the agreed cadence. Every interruption resets logic. Every reset burns time. Tier 3 advisors protect the bay by protecting the process they sold. One update window. That is leadership. The fourth skill is translation without distortion. When results come back, you do not editorialize. You do not soften. You do not dramatize. You translate evidence into plain truth and present responsible paths, verified repair, targeted next test, or documented monitoring plan. Each path is grounded in what was actually proven, not in what would feel most relieving to say. Finally, you lock consent with documentation. Diagnostics unravel when the story gets blurry. Clear notes, what was tested, what was ruled out, what was confirmed, what was not found, and what happens next. Protect the customer, the technician, and the shop. Documentation is not bureaucracy. It is memory that holds up under pressure. This is the diagnostic consent ladder TM in action. Not louder. Not faster. Just cleaner. When you lead diagnostics this way, uncertainty stops spreading chaos. It becomes a controlled environment where trust grows before the answer is even known. That is authority without pretending. This chapter sets a non-negotiable Tier 3 standard for diagnostics. First, you stop using certainty as a performance tool. You do not guess to sound competent. You do not imply outcomes to relieve pressure. You lead with honesty that is structured, calm, and bounded. Second, you sell diagnostic process, not parts, not predictions. You define brackets, checkpoints, and communication cadence so the customer stays in control and the technician stays focused. Third, you protect consent all the way through. Nothing moves without understanding. Nothing changes without documentation. And no repair is quoted until testing has earned the right to that conclusion. This is how you prevent one diagnostic job from bending the entire day around itself. This is how you stop complexity from infecting the schedule, the bay, and the relationship with the customer. Tier 3 advisors are not rushed by uncertainty. They are not threatened by, "I don't know yet." They understand that honesty, when paired with structure, creates more trust than confident guesses ever will. The challenge is precise. On your next multi-system diagnostic job, refuse the shortcut. When asked for an answer you don't have, don't fill the space with a guess. Fill it with process. Define the bracket, set the checkpoint, protect the bay, document the story, because in advanced service leadership, authority is not proven by how quickly you speak. It's proven by how well the truth holds together over time. That is multi-system diagnostics at Tier 3.